Welcome to Animal Cognition Lecture 1, Part 2. In this part, I'm going to be discussing some of the historical background to the study of animal cognition. Obviously, it's going to be a very sparse discussion because we'd need too much time to cover everything. So I'm going to just hit on a few ideas. We're going to start by discussing Aristotle's idea of the great chain of being. And then we're going to discuss how Descartes carried forward some of these ideas in arguing for mental discontinuity between animals and humans. And then we're going to discuss Darwin's contribution to animal cognition, Darwin stressing the idea of mental continuity between species. All right, so in Western culture, there's often been a sharp distinction that's been drawn between between animals and humans, and not just in terms of the physical characteristics, obviously, but in terms of mental characteristics as well. And this, in many ways, can be traced back to Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher. And one of the things that Aristotle did is he argued for what's called the great chain of being. And this is the idea that the relationship between all living things can be represented in a clear hierarchy. It's a hierarchy of what he called reality, right? The top of the hierarchy is perfection, and the bottom is represented by the least perfect, most simplest things. And then there's everything in between. And this idea can be represented in this figure here. We see at the very top, there's God, the most real, most perfect thing. And on the very bottom, we have inanimate things like rocks. And then starting from the bottom, we have, so from rocks, we go to plants, then lower animals like frogs, then the higher animals like lions. Then we have humans. Then between humans and God, there's angels. So what's important about this is the idea that there's clear distinctions between each level. Each level up has characteristics that are not possessed by members one level down. Okay, so each jump in this great chain of being, new things emerge, things that weren't there before, not just in terms of physical characteristics, but also in terms of psychological characteristics. So for Aristotle, for example, lower animals would lack some mental characteristics that higher animals have, and higher animals would lack certain psychological characteristics that humans would have, and humans would lack characteristics, mental characteristics that God and angels possess. All right, so this is an idea of discontinuity. Each level is distinct, has distinct characteristics from the ones below it. Now, jumping forward a couple thousand years to the great philosopher René Descartes, we see that he carried forward many of the assumptions that underlie this idea of the great chain of being. Now, as you probably know, Descartes was a genius who revolutionized many different areas, including mathematics and physics and so on. But from our perspective, we discuss him because he's one of the first comparative psychologists. Right? He was really interested in comparing the minds of humans to those of other animals. And what he saw was some similarities, but also some very important differences, which is where the idea of discontinuity comes in. Right? So he argued for a sharp separation between the minds of animals and the minds of humans. And in particular, he said that only humans are capable of reason, right? Only humans can think. Animals do not think, only humans. So in terms of non-reasoning psychological characteristics, Descartes thought that humans and animals were very similar, right? So humans and animals share mental traits, right? So for example, animals like humans can perceive the world around them, right? They can detect information from the world around them. They can have emotional reactions to those things. They can also create memories, right? Animals and humans can remember things about their environment. And they can also learn, right? They can also learn relationships in their environment. Right, so in terms of these, what he called lower level psychological functions, Descartes said there's a continuity between humans and animals. And what's also interesting is that Descartes thought that we could explain these lower level psychological functions physically, right? We could explain them by studying the nervous system of animals and humans. Why? Because he thought that these lower level functions were purely mechanical. So as an example of these kinds of mechanisms, here's Descartes' explanation of a reflex. Right, so animals and humans both are capable of reflexive responses. So what's the mechanical explanation here? By the way, this drawing is actually from Descartes. Right, you may have seen it before. So the reflex works as follows. Right? Heat causes nerves of the foot to, what he said, pull, right, sending a signal up the nerve to the pineal gland, which secretes what he called animal spirits, and these go down the same nerve and affect the muscles which cause the foot to move. Right, a purely physical, mechanical response. And you'll notice that it's the same nerve that provides afferent and efferent signals. Okay, so he said that these kinds of mechanical explanations would apply to both animals and humans. Now a little bit more about this pineal gland. Right, for Descartes, the pineal gland was a very special place. He said it was the center of the mind because he found that it's the only part of the brain that there's only one of. Right, in the brain, there's a lot of duplication. So you see something on the left and you see something corresponding on the right half of the brain. But the pineal gland, he said, is solitary. So he said it's a center of the mind, and stimulation of the pineal gland causes perceptions, emotions, and behaviors on the parts of animals and humans. And this can be seen in the following figure, also from Descartes. Here a person is looking at an arrow, and the arrow, right, light strikes the arrow and then enters the eyes, and this causes the nerves inside the back of the eye, inside the retina, to pull in unique ways given what the eyes are looking at. Right, so the arrow causes the nerves in the back of the eye. The light from the arrow, sorry. The light from the arrow causes the nerves at the back of the eye to pull in unique ways, and this pulling creates a chain reaction which causes a unique pattern of activity on the pineal gland. Right, so the pineal gland nerves are pulled in a very specific way when the arrow is looked at. Right, so each object that is looked at creates a unique pattern of activity. And he said that this pattern of activity on the pineal gland functions as a representation of the object. Right, so he liked the idea of mental representation. Animals and humans carry around mental representations, which are unique patterns of activity on the pineal gland. And these patterns of stimulation also constitute memories for the objects, which can be triggered later on. Right, when you see it again, you can remember that you saw it before. And these representations can also cause behavior. Okay? So to summarize, for Descartes, perception, emotion, memory, and action at the lowest levels can be explained in the same way for animals and humans. So far, this is all continuity, right? So where does the discontinuity come in? It comes in because Descartes says that only humans are capable of thinking and reasoning. Why? Why this discontinuity between animals and humans? For the simple reason that animals cannot talk. Right? Animals can't reason because animals cannot talk. So as Descartes says, this shows not merely that the beasts have less reason than men, but that they have no reason at all. Right? So that's a clear statement of discontinuity. So how did he arrive at this, right? Well, Descartes equated thought and reason with the capacity to produce and understand language. Right? He doesn't explain why thinking requires language, right? But he simply assumed that was the case. Right? He doesn't explain why. And this is important because a lot of his arguments are based on failures of the imagination. Like, I can't imagine how thinking could take place without language. Therefore, thinking must use language. But with these kinds of claims, it's always possible that you're wrong, that maybe you're just not imagining very well. Right? So maybe thinking is possible with strings of images, right? Instead of words. And we'll see that later on Darwin actually made that claim. Okay, so Descartes stressed discontinuity in terms of the ability to reason. And Darwin counteracted a lot of this by contributing the notion of continuity between species. Right? So he said the differences in mental characteristics between humans and other animals are often a matter of degree, not of kind. So why did Darwin stress continuity? Well, it falls naturally out of his thinking about evolution. Right? Remember that with evolution, species evolve from other species. Right? And the process involved is natural selection. And because of that, right, because species are related to each other, we should expect to find similarities or differences that are a matter of degree instead of these sharp distinctions from one level to the next. Right, so remember that with evolution, species are related through common descent, also known as descent with modification. Right? Descent with modification means this, that natural selection is always working on existing structures. It's always modifying what's already there to create something that's better suited to an environment. Right, so this idea of common descent can be represented with what's called the tree of life. Right, the tree of life is actually a very bad metaphor because a tree kind of implies that there's kind of a linear progression. So when biologists represent the tree of life, they represent it more like this. What we have in the center is the center of the circle is the first self-replicating things, right? The first things that are capable of making copies of themselves. And on the outer edge of the circle, we have the existing species, right? Plants, protists, fungi, animals, and so on. And what we can see with this figure is that through a process, or through a long period of time, the first self-replicating entities evolved into the myriad forms of life that we see in the world today. Right? Everything is related to everything else through common descent. Everything can be traced back to those first self-replicating entities. And keep this image in mind as we progress, right? So this idea of evolution topples the great chain of being, right? There is no single hierarchy in nature, right? As we just saw with this figure, there is no single being at the top. There is no most perfect being, and there is no simple linear scale from the simplest organisms to the most complex. Right? What we see in nature is this differentiation, this proliferation of species as each species tries to adapt to its current circumstances. right? Each creature adapts to its unique environment. So you may be a little bit rusty in your natural selection, for those of you who didn't take evolutionary psychology. But basically the idea behind natural selection is that in any given generation, some individuals will have characteristics that give them an edge in terms of survival or reproduction. Right? So some creatures will be likelier to survive and reproduce. And if these characteristics are heritable, if they can be passed on from one individual to another, then those traits will spread throughout the population, causing the species to change. So, for example, let's take the case of thicker fur for, say, Arctic foxes or polar bears. Right? In any given generation, thicker fur or those Arctic foxes with thicker coats in the winter may be likelier to survive and hence be more likely to pass on their genes. And if that's the case, and those genes encode for thicker fur, then that trait will spread through the population. Right, so natural selection is important because it produces what are called adaptations. Adaptations are inherited solutions to long-standing problems of survival and reproduction. So, for example, sweat glands are adaptations, right? And they solve the problem of thermal regulation, right? So the way that they work, sweat glands, what they do is they release moisture onto the surface of the skin. That moisture absorbs heat from the body, and then the air carries it away. Okay, so this is an example of an adaptation. Adaptations are inherited solutions to long-standing problems of survival and reproduction. And importantly, adaptations are specific to an environment. They're specific to the challenges that are faced by a species, right? Because what's adaptive in one environment may not necessarily be adaptive in another environment. So to get back to animal cognition, according to Darwin, natural selection leads us to expect continuity between species, right? As I said, because natural selection is always working on existing structures. So if continuity was not true, if we saw these sharp rifts between one species and another, right? Darwin says natural selection would be in trouble. Here's what he has to say in The Descent of Man. If no organic being excepting man had possessed any mental power, or if his powers had been of a wholly different nature from those of lower animals, then we should never have been able to convince ourselves that our higher faculties had been gradually developed. But it can be clearly shown that there is no fundamental difference of this kind. There is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. Okay? So he says there is continuity, even in terms of the higher faculties. And in Descent of Man, Darwin discusses various traits of humans and argues that you can see, you can see many of them in some form or other in other animals. Right, and this serves the rhetorical point of arguing that they could have evolved through a gradual process of natural selection. So some examples of mental continuity, beginning with emotions, he says that you can find things like happiness, fear, courage, rage, love, shame, and wonder, and curiosity in other animals. Right, and in parentheses we have, I've listed some of the species that he says that he has seen demonstrating these mental characteristics. Okay? And actually he has a whole book on the evolution of the emotions. And in terms of intellectual functions, he says that you can find things like imitation in dogs, monkeys, and birds. You can see a mental faculty of attention at work in cats and monkeys. He discusses examples of baboons, dogs, and ants displaying memory, imagination and dreams, reason and problem solving in monkeys, dogs, and rats, tool use in chimpanzees and baboons, learning from experience, self-consciousness, communication, and even religious awareness, right? Which he says can be seen in dogs. I'm not sure how he knows that, but that's what he says. Okay, so these are pretty high-level psychological functions, including some that Descartes would clearly say belong to humans but not other animals. And even in terms of language, Darwin offered a theory of how language in humans evolved from precursors that we see in other animals. But importantly, he also tackles the Cartesian point about the link between language and thought. Darwin agrees that for humans, language is essential to thought. Right? He says, a long and complex train of thought can no more be carried on without the aid of words, whether spoken or silent, than a long calculation without the use of figures or algebra. But for the animals, he says, nevertheless, a long succession of vivid and connected ideas may pass through the mind, without the aid of any form of language, as we may infer from the prolonged dreams of dogs. Right, so again, maybe thinking can take place using images instead of words. I know, for example, when I'm trying to fix something in my house, let's say I'm trying to fix some plumbing or other, I'll catch myself entertaining images and manipulating images as I'm trying to figure things out. Now, from a methodological perspective about how we should go about studying animal cognition, this is where things fall apart for Darwin. Right? He offered little by way of a method for systematically studying animal cognition. Instead, he relied on what are called anecdotes. And anecdotes are accounts, descriptions of animal behavior that are passed on by observers. Right? And they usually involve describing the behavior in terms that attribute a lot of mental states. Right? They're not just behavioristic descriptions of what the animal is doing. They attribute a lot of mental states to the animals involved. Here's a quote from Darwin. Right? Even insects play together, as has been described by that excellent observer, P. Huber, who saw ants chasing and pretending to bite each other like so many puppies. Okay? That's a pretty, heavy-handed attribution of intentions to something as small as an ant. Now, later in life, Darwin met George Romanes, and Romanes carried on a lot of Darwin's work in animal cognition, and he wrote a great book called Animal Intelligence. And animal intelligence sought to support Darwin's claims about continuity between animals and humans, and it contained a lot of anecdotes. But as I said, what's wrong is that they attribute uncritically a lot of human motives, a lot of human mental states to the behavior animals, which may not be there, right? So the problem is that a lot of his anecdotes are anthropomorphic, right? They attribute to animals human characteristics and motives to describe and explain their behavior. Okay, so as we, given what we said last time about the fact that there's always multiple routes to a certain behavior, we need to be aware of the possibility that animals could behave in certain ways for very different reasons. Right, so we always have to be mindful of the fact that while animals and human minds may be similar in some respects, it's also possible for them to work very differently because of their own unique evolutionary history. All right, next lecture I'm going to examine some of Romanes' anecdotes, and we're also going to examine how to test these claims and how to test them using rigorous experimental procedures. And it's this that's really the hallmark of modern animal cognition research, right? Stressing the importance of well-structured, well-controlled experiments.